The silence in the Imperial Palace's war room was deafening. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood before the ornate map table, his weathered hands trembling as he traced the blue waters surrounding Midway Atoll. The cherry blossoms outside had long since fallen, but their memory seemed to mock the devastation that had befallen the combined fleet on June 4, 1942. Emperor Hirohito's piercing gaze swept across the assembled officers, each man bearing the invisible wounds of Japan's most catastrophic naval defeat. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay at the bottom of the Pacific, taking with them the cream of Japan's naval aviation and the myth of imperial invincibility. "Gentlemen," Yamamoto's voice barely rose above a whisper, "we must face the consequences of our failure." The architect of Pearl Harbor felt the weight of his miscalculation like a stone in his chest. He had promised the Emperor a swift victory that would force America to negotiate peace. Instead, he had delivered disaster on an unprecedented scale. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the ill-fated carrier strike force, sat rigid in his chair, his face a mask of stoic discipline that barely concealed his inner torment. General Hideki Tojo, the prime minister whose militaristic vision had driven Japan deeper into war, cleared his throat. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the hushed chamber. "The losses must be concealed from the people," he declared with characteristic bluntness. "Our citizens cannot know the extent of this defeat." The conspiracy of silence that would define Japan's response to Midway began in that moment. Wounded survivors were quarantined in hospitals, forbidden from speaking to family or friends about what they had witnessed. Casualty lists were classified at the highest levels, and propaganda newspapers would continue to trumpet victories that existed only in fiction. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, studied the latest intelligence reports with growing dread. American industrial capacity was ramping up at an alarming rate, while Japan's shipyards struggled to replace even a fraction of what had been lost. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the enemy, and every senior officer in the room knew it. Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician who had helped plan both Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation, spoke for the first time since entering the chamber. "The American pilots fought with unexpected skill," he admitted reluctantly. "Their dive bombers found our carriers at the most vulnerable moment, decks loaded with fuel and ordnance." According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive account, the timing of the American attack was indeed catastrophic for the Japanese fleet, catching their carriers in the midst of rearming aircraft for a second strike. The Emperor's voice cut through the discussion like a blade. "What measures will be taken to prevent such disasters in the future?" His question carried the implicit understanding that failure was no longer acceptable, yet the men before him knew that Japan's strategic position had fundamentally shifted. Yamamoto exchanged glances with his subordinates, recognizing the impossible situation they faced. The combined fleet's pilot training programs had been decimated along with the carriers. Experienced aviators who had taken years to train were irreplaceable, while American flight schools were producing new pilots at an industrial pace. As the meeting concluded, each man carried the burden of knowledge that would haunt them for the remainder of the war. The shame of Midway would fester in secret, eating away at Japan's military leadership like a cancer. 3 weeks after the disaster, Admiral Yamamoto retreated to his private quarters aboard the battleship Yamato, anchored in Kure Harbor. The flagship's steel bulkhead seemed to close in around him as he penned a letter that would never be sent. A confession to his former teacher at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. "My dear professor," he wrote in careful English, the language of his enemies, "I fear I have led my nation down a path from which we cannot return." The letter detailed his growing realization that Japan's victory at Pearl Harbor had been Pyrrhic, at best. The attack had united American public opinion in a way that no amount of propaganda could have achieved, transforming a reluctant democracy into an engine of total war. Now, with 4 fleet carriers at the bottom of the Pacific, that engine was beginning to show its true power. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack but missed Midway due to illness, visited his commander with disturbing news from the front lines. "Admiral," he reported with barely contained emotion, "the Americans are launching new carriers faster than we can build destroyers. The Essex and Independence classes are already showing up in reconnaissance reports." Yamamoto nodded grimly. He had spent enough time in America to understand their industrial capacity, but even he had underestimated their ability to mobilize resources. Japanese shipyards, meanwhile, were already struggling with material shortages as the American submarine campaign began to bite. The conspiracy of silence extended beyond mere propaganda. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, head of the Navy Ministry's personnel section, had been tasked with the impossible job of replacing the lost aircrew without revealing the extent of the losses. Training programs were accelerated beyond all reason, sending barely competent pilots into combat where they faced increasingly experienced American aviators. "We are sending children to fight veterans," Watanabe confided to Yamamoto during a private meeting. "The replacement pilots have perhaps 1/10 the flight time of the men we lost at Midway." The psychological impact of the defeat rippled through Japan's military hierarchy. Admiral Nagumo, once considered one of the Navy's rising stars, had become a broken man. His staff officers reported that he barely slept, spending hours staring at nautical charts and muttering about what might have been. Vice Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, who had gone down with his flagship Hiryu, had been posthumously promoted and lionized as a hero. Yet privately, senior officers questioned his decision to launch a final desperate attack rather than preserving his experienced air crews for future battles. The cult of death before dishonor was consuming Japan's most valuable resource, competent leadership. Intelligence reports painted an increasingly grim picture of American capabilities. The codebreakers who had given Japan such an advantage at Pearl Harbor now found themselves outmatched by improved American communication security. Worse still, there were growing suspicions that the Americans had broken Japan's own naval codes, explaining their uncanny ability to position forces at the most advantageous locations. Emperor Hirohito's private audiences with his military advisors became exercises in carefully managed reality. The truth about Midway was rationed out in small doses, each revelation cushioned by promises of future victories that fewer and fewer officers believed were possible. As Yamamoto sealed his unsent letter, he reflected on a conversation he had once had with his American counterpart, Admiral Chester Nimitz, before the war. Nimitz had warned him that America's greatest strength lay not in any single battle, but in their ability to learn from defeats and adapt their tactics accordingly. Now, as reports filtered in of aggressive American operations throughout the Pacific, Yamamoto understood that his former colleague had been prophetic. The shame of Midway was not just in the defeat itself, but in the recognition that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant that would not rest until the rising sun was extinguished forever. By October 1942, the elaborate deception surrounding Midway began showing cracks that no amount of propaganda could seal. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto's chief of staff, found himself juggling increasingly desperate requests from field commanders who needed the carriers and pilots that no longer existed. The Guadalcanal campaign had become a grinding meat grinder for what remained of Japan's naval aviation. Every week brought new requests for reinforcements that simply could not be provided. Admiral Jinichi Kusaka, commanding the 11th Air Fleet, sent increasingly frantic messages demanding to know why his veteran squadrons were not being replaced with equally experienced units. "Where are the Akagi's air groups?" Kusaka demanded during a secure telephone conference. "Intelligence reports suggest they were not at Midway, yet they have not appeared at any other theater." The lie was becoming impossible to maintain. 2. Many families had lost sons who had supposedly been transferred to other units. Too many mechanics recognized the absence of aircraft that should have been available for routine operations. Lieutenant Colonel Takushiro Hattori, from the Army General Staff, attended a joint meeting where the truth finally surfaced completely. The rivalry between Japan's Army and Navy had always been fierce, but now it took on desperate overtones as both services competed for increasingly scarce resources. "The Navy has lost 4 fleet carriers, and you kept this from us for 4 months?" Hattori's voice rose to nearly a shout. "Do you understand what this means for our strategic planning?" According to Walter Lord's detailed research in Incredible Victory, The Japanese military's compartmentalized nature had indeed allowed such deceptions to persist longer than should have been possible. But the demands of ongoing operations eventually forced the truth into the open. The psychological toll on Japan's leadership became increasingly evident. Admiral Nagumo was quietly reassigned to shore duty, officially for health reasons, but everyone understood that he had become a liability. His replacement, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, inherited a carrier force that existed primarily on paper. Emperor Hirohito's private secretary, Marquis Koichi Kido, began documenting the growing list of strategic reversals in his diary. The Emperor's questions during briefings became more pointed, more skeptical of the rosy scenarios presented by his military advisors. The myth of infallibility that had sustained Japanese leadership was crumbling along with their strategic position. General Tojo found himself caught between competing pressures. The army demanded greater resources for the China campaign and the defense of conquered territories, while the Navy pleaded for time to rebuild their shattered carrier forces. Meanwhile, American industrial production continued its relentless acceleration. The Solomon Islands campaign revealed the full extent of Japan's pilot shortage. Green aviators rushed through abbreviated training programs, were being shot down at rates that horrified veteran commanders. Flight training that had once taken 2 years was compressed into 6 months, producing pilots who could barely land on a carrier deck in calm seas, let alone conduct complex combat operations. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudomi, replacing the exhausted Kuroshima as Combined Fleet Chief of Staff, inherited a strategic situation that defied solution. Every operational plan had to account for resources that no longer existed, while maintaining the fiction that Japan's naval power remained intact. The intelligence picture grew increasingly dark. American submarines were sinking merchant vessels faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, already straining under the burden of occupation, began showing signs of resource exhaustion. Yamamoto's health visibly deteriorated under the stress of command. Subordinates noted his increasing pallor and the way his hands shook when he thought no one was watching. The architect of Japan's greatest naval victory had become the custodian of its most devastating defeat. As 1942 drew to a close, the senior leadership finally acknowledged what junior officers had suspected for months. The war that was supposed to last 6 months had become a prolonged struggle that Japan was increasingly unlikely to win. The shame of Midway had metastasized into a more profound recognition of strategic bankruptcy. The new year of 1943 brought Emperor Hirohito face to face with truths that his military advisors could no longer disguise. The divine sovereign, seated in his austere study overlooking the palace gardens, received briefings that painted an increasingly desperate picture of Japan's strategic position. "Your Majesty," Admiral Nagano began hesitantly, "the Americans have launched 17 new aircraft carriers since Midway. Our intelligence estimates suggest they will commission 30 more by year's end." The Emperor's silence stretched uncomfortably as he absorbed the implications. Behind his thick glasses, his eyes showed a keen intelligence that his public persona rarely revealed. He had been educated in marine biology, understanding the principles of adaptation and survival that his military commanders seemed to have forgotten. Prince Fumimaro Konoe, the former prime minister who had warned against war with America, sat in obvious discomfort as the briefing continued. His earlier predictions of disaster were proving prophetic, but there was no satisfaction in being right when the consequences were so catastrophic. The Battle of the Philippine Sea loomed on the horizon, though none present could foresee that it would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. What they did know was that Japan's remaining carrier pilots were inadequately trained and facing increasingly sophisticated American air defenses. Commander Minoru Genda, now recovered from wounds suffered in an air raid, presented the most honest assessment yet heard in the imperial presence. "Your Majesty, we are sending pilots into combat who have perhaps 50 hours of flight time. The Americans we face have been in continuous combat for over a year. The mathematical certainty of the outcome cannot be disguised." The Emperor's questions revealed a strategic mind that his advisors had consistently underestimated. "If our position is as desperate as you suggest, what options remain available to us?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke. General Tojo's jaw worked silently as he struggled to formulate an answer that would not constitute defeatism. The military code that had driven Japan into war now prevented its leaders from acknowledging the logical conclusion of their strategic position. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, recently returned from diplomatic missions that had yielded no meaningful support from Germany or other Axis partners, finally spoke. "Your Majesty, there may come a time when we must consider whether continuing this struggle serves the best interests of the Japanese people." The treasonous words, for that is how they would have been characterized just months earlier, met with nods rather than outrage. The accumulated weight of defeats had finally forced Japan's leadership to confront reality. Yamamoto's intelligence staff presented evidence that American codebreakers had indeed penetrated Japanese naval communications. The admiral, who had once been compared to Lord Nelson, now understood that his every move was being anticipated by enemies who could read his intentions almost as quickly as he could formulate them. The domestic situation added another layer of pressure. Food rationing had become severe and industrial production was declining as strategic materials became unavailable. The empire that had promised prosperity to its conquered territories was stripping them bare to feed its own survival. According to historians such as Herbert Bix in Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan, the emperor's role in strategic decision-making was more active than post-war accounts suggested, and his growing skepticism of military optimism marked a crucial turning point. Admiral Somu Toyota, who would soon replace Yamamoto as commander of the combined fleet following the latter's death in the Solomon Islands, understood that he was inheriting an impossible situation. The fleet he would command existed largely in imagination, sustained by wishful thinking rather than material reality. The meeting concluded with an unprecedented acknowledgement. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan's leadership admitted, privately, that the war's outcome was no longer certain. The shame of Midway had evolved into something far more dangerous to the regime, the possibility that the divine emperor's subjects might begin questioning the wisdom of their leaders' decisions. As winter deepened, the palace's war rooms became stages for increasingly surreal performances, where everyone knew the script was fiction, but none dared admit it publicly. April 18, 1943, marked the end of an era when admirals Yamamoto's transport aircraft was intercepted and shot down over Bougainville. The architect of Pearl Harbor's death sent shockwaves through Japan's already demoralized naval command, but it also provided a convenient scapegoat for the mounting disasters. Admiral Minechi Koga, Yamamoto's successor as commander of the combined fleet, inherited an impossible legacy. The man who had warned against war with America was gone, leaving behind subordinates who understood the mathematical certainty of defeat, but lacked the courage to articulate it clearly. The Solomon Islands campaign had become a graveyard for what remained of Japan's experienced pilots. Admiral Ozawa's carrier groups, rebuilt with green aviators and obsolete aircraft, faced American forces that grew stronger with each passing month. The industrial disparity that Yamamoto had feared was manifesting itself in ways that defied comprehension. Captain Atsushi Oi, serving on the Naval General Staff, compiled reports that read like obituaries for the Imperial Navy. Fuel shortages limited training flights to barely adequate levels. Replacement aircraft were of inferior quality due to material shortages. Most damaging of all, the pilot training programs that had once produced the world's finest naval aviators were now graduating barely competent beginners. Emperor Hirohito's private conversations with his advisors took on increasingly desperate tones. The sovereign who had once believed in his military's promises of swift victory now questioned every optimistic assessment. "Are you certain these reports are accurate?" became his standard response to briefings about Japanese capabilities. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would provide the final proof of Japan's naval aviation collapse, but by then, the pattern was already clear to anyone willing to see it. Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher's Task Force 58 faced Japanese carriers whose air groups were shadows of their former selves. General Korichika Anami, representing the Army's perspective, found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending resources that could have been better utilized elsewhere. The Navy's insistence on rebuilding carrier forces had consumed materials desperately needed for homeland defense. Intelligence reports painted an increasingly grim picture of American capabilities. The Essex-class carriers that had seemed like distant threats in 1942 were now arriving in the Pacific at a rate of one per month. Each new vessel carried air groups that were better equipped and more experienced than their predecessors. The conspiracy of silence that had begun after Midway now extended to virtually every aspect of Japan's strategic position. Casualty figures were classified, industrial production statistics were manipulated, and even basic intelligence about enemy capabilities was filtered through layers of wishful thinking. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu's attempts to explore diplomatic solutions met with resistance from military leaders who could not accept the logical consequences of their strategic situation. The concept of surrender, even conditional surrender, remained unthinkable to officers whose entire careers had been built on the myth of Japanese invincibility. As documented in Richard Frank's comprehensive study Downfall, Japan's leadership was trapped between the mathematical certainty of defeat and the political impossibility of acknowledging it, creating a paralysis that would persist until the atomic bombs finally shattered their delusions. Admiral Toyoda's appointment as Yamamoto's replacement brought fresh perspectives but no new solutions. The combined fleet he commanded was a hollow shell, maintained by bureaucratic momentum rather than actual combat capability. Training accidents claimed more pilots than enemy action in some months. The Emperor's biologist training served him well in understanding the principles of adaptation under pressure. Unlike his military advisors, he grasped that Japan's strategic environment had changed fundamentally, and that survival might require abandoning cherished assumptions about honor and victory. By late 1944, the shame of Midway had transformed into something far more profound: the recognition that Japan's entire strategic conception had been fatally flawed from the beginning. The naval aviation that had carried the empire to its greatest heights lay at the bottom of the Pacific, and no amount of desperate improvisation could resurrect it. The final act of Japan's naval tragedy played out in the waters around Okinawa, where Admiral Toyoda's remaining forces made their last desperate gambit. The kamikaze attacks that began in earnest during the Philippines campaign represented the ultimate admission of conventional failure. When skill and equipment proved inadequate, only suicidal dedication remained. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze program, embodied the spiritual bankruptcy that had consumed Japan's military leadership. The man who had once planned conventional air operations now organized mass suicide attacks, treating human life as just another expendable resource in a war that could no longer be won. Emperor Hirohito's audiences with his military commanders became exercises in managed despair. Admiral Toyoda's briefings acknowledged American naval superiority in terms that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. The combined fleet that had once dominated the Pacific was reduced to a handful of vessels hiding in Japanese harbors. The shame of Midway had metastasized into something far more toxic: the recognition that Japan's entire strategic culture was fundamentally flawed. Admiral Ugaki Matomi, Yamamoto's former chief of staff, spent his final months organizing attacks by pilots who could barely fly, let alone fight effectively against experienced American aviators. General MacArthur's island-hopping campaign systematically dismantled Japan's defensive perimeter, while Admiral Nimitz's carrier task forces operated with impunity throughout the Western Pacific. The industrial capacity that had once seemed like America's only advantage had become an unstoppable force that rendered Japanese resistance increasingly meaningless. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 provided the final punctuation to a war that had been lost at Midway 3 years earlier. Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast acknowledged defeat in terms that his military advisors had been unable to articulate throughout the conflict. Admiral Toyoda's final report to the Emperor contained a brutal assessment of Japan's naval collapse. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were gone. The pilots who had achieved initial victories were dead. The industrial base that might have sustained a prolonged war had been systematically destroyed by American bombing campaigns. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East would later examine the decisions that led to Japan's catastrophic defeat, but the real judgment had already been rendered in the waters of the Pacific. The naval aviation that had once seemed invincible had been systematically annihilated by enemies who proved more adaptable, more innovative, and ultimately more determined than their Japanese opponents. Yamamoto's prophecy about awakening a sleeping giant had proven accurate in ways that even he had not anticipated. The America that Japan had attacked was not the same nation that emerged from the Pacific War. Industrial mobilization had transformed a reluctant democracy into a global superpower whose military capabilities dwarfed those of any potential opponent. The officers who survived Japan's defeat carried with them the knowledge of how completely they had misjudged their enemies and overestimated their own capabilities. Admiral Nagumo's suicide in Saipan epitomized the psychological destruction that accompanied military defeat. As Japan's representatives signed the surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the symbolic weight of the moment was impossible to ignore. The ceremony took place on the deck of an American battleship that had not even existed when Yamamoto planned his attack on Pearl Harbor. The shame of Midway had ultimately consumed not just Japan's naval aviation, but the entire strategic conception that had driven the empire to war. The leaders who had promised swift victory and negotiated peace instead delivered total defeat and unconditional surrender. Their failure would haunt Japan for generations, serving as a permanent reminder of the dangers of strategic overreach and cultural blindness. In the end, the Battle of Midway had been more than a tactical defeat. It was the moment when Japan's leadership should have recognized the impossibility of their strategic position. Their failure to do so transformed a single battle's casualties into a civilizational catastrophe that destroyed the empire they had sought to preserve.